What was Jesus doing on Easter? Increasingly, I found this as a helpful question for me to think about and to pose for us to think about. What was Jesus doing on Easter? Because sometimes I think we have the image or the impression Jesus on Easter was like he's showing off, like he's displaying his magnificent power, and it's almost like, look what I could do in your life if I chose to, but I rarely do, so sorry. That's not what's happening on Easter. On Easter Sunday, Jesus is beginning the recreation of the universe which he loves. Which came into existence through him. And one day he will gloriously return, and he will make everything perfect. There will be no sickness, no sadness, no sorrow, no death, no goodbye, no crying. It'll be perfection like we can't even imagine. But until that time, this gap between when he began the recreation of the universe and when he comes back and he makes all things perfectly new, what are you and I supposed to be doing? That's the final chapter. Getting clarity on the mission. And we would argue in Acts 29 that there's a remarkable lack of clarity. First, on the mission of Jesus. Why did he come? But we've looked at that. But now we want to try to understand, well, what about us? Like, what is he sending us to do? What's our mission? So a set of months ago, we got an email from a woman who's become a friend of ours now who said, there's a bunch of us in the Marines, we listen to you all on the podcast, and you guys you're talking about things that sound like a lot of the structures that we build as Marines. We'd like to have a conversation with you. I'm like, that'd be great, So Mary and our team, her husband's a Marine. Once a Marine, always Marine. So we had a call and have spent some time together since, and one of the things that was communicated to us is one of the things that the Corps is often doing when they're training their officers is you got to make sure that all of the soldiers in your command, they have crystal clarity on the mission. We're doing X in order to Y. Right? We're landing in Okinawa in order to what? We're taking that hill in order to what? We're dropping into this village in order to what? Because if you don't have clarity on the mission, when things begin to break down, like morale just dissipates like crazy and people die. We would argue that in the church, there's remarkable lack of clarity on our mission as disciples of Jesus. So we've looked at the personal response, like surrender or faith, thanksgiving. But we want to take a minute to look at the outward-focused response, right? What is Jesus sending us to do? And one of the ways to get into this is to look at the passage when Jesus says in the Gospels, he says, you, David, you are the light of the world. People don't light a lamp and put it under a basket. Why? That would be stupid. That's why, right? It would burn the basket and nobody could see. Like you don't turn lights on and then cover the lights with duct tape. You turn lights on so people can see. Right? So no one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. They put it on a stand where it gives light to everybody in the house. And when he says a lamp, what he's talking about is that little picture right there. It's a lychnos in Greek. I just like that word. It's kind of fun to say. It's a lychnos. Right? A lychnos is a little hand lamp about the size of this remote control. I have one from the first century. It's really cool. Well, who's the lamp? You are. I am. Who's the hand that picks it up? Jesus. What's the stand? Wherever you happen to be at that particular moment. Could be in the supermarket, could be in your kitchen, could be at the soccer game, could be on the radio, doesn't matter where you are. And what's the house? It's the world. I have one next to my bed and I have it there so that when I wake up, if I wake up, I look at it and I go, oh yeah, Lord, like pick me up today and just help me to be cognizant of the fact that wherever I go, you're carrying me and you want to shine through me. Me, broken, frazzled, selfish, me. So let's try to understand what Jesus is saying here, because I think a lot of us as disciples, we encounter Jesus, we get overwhelmed, we hear the gospel, and then, at least my experience personally, both me and then personally in terms of walking with others, what people do in response is they go, okay, I got to get serious now about the Christian life. I got to get rid of sin. I got to grow in virtue. I got to become holy. Well, those are really important things. Like, by all means, try to become holy. Root out sin. Grow in virtue. But that's not the mission. The mission is to go and do something. So C.S. Lewis, in that passage that we looked at earlier, he says the story of Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed in disguise, and then I love this part. And he calls us all to engage in a great campaign of sabotage. Now, if you had told me as a 12-year-old boy to be a Christian is to be involved in sabotage, you're going to blow things up, I'm like, I'm in. But lest we be confused, given the climate that we're living in right now, the weapons, quote unquote, if you will, of this campaign are goodness, truth, beauty, mercy, reconciliation, and so much more. It's not a violent campaign of sabotage. Not the way the world understands it. So we would argue that the mission, if you will, can get compressed into, we're being intentionally provocative here perhaps, to 6 words, or 7 if you combine the first 2 words in the first one. Sabotage and resistance, reconciliation, recreation, healing, restoration, and ambassadors. I want to try to put some flesh on those for us. So sabotage is defined as the deliberate attempt to damage, destroy, or hinder a cause or activity as by civilians or enemy agents in a time of war. It's a French word. It doesn't show up in the Bible. But resistance does. Resistance is defined as taking action in opposition to. And we saw this passage earlier in 1 Peter, when Peter says about the devil, the enemy, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him. Firm in your faith. There's 2 meanings to that. The first is like, don't cave. Don't give in. When temptations come, resist him. But that's not the only meaning to that. It also means oppose him. Go to work against him. I have a desire to do as much as I can in proclaiming the gospel to blow up the enemy's kingdom as I can. To help people see his lies. To help those who are now as I once was. Enslaved, ensnared, fearful, anxious, living without hope. Resist him. Let me give you an image of that. On December 1st, 1955, a woman was coming home from work. She took the bus home every day. In the city where she lived, the first 10 rows of the bus were reserved permanently for whites. She wasn't white. So she sat in the 11th row. And the first 10 rows filled up quickly, and the bus driver asked everybody to move back. Told everybody to move back. 3 people moved back, she didn't. Then the bus driver ordered her to move back. She wouldn't move. The bus driver calls the police, has the woman arrested. She's officially charged with resisting the orders of a bus driver. She goes to prison. Thus begins a 381-day bus strike in Montgomery, Alabama. It pulls in a 26-year-old African-American preacher named Martin Luther King. It so begins the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks was asked afterwards, why didn't you get up? She said, I was tired. Not like I was physically tired. I was tired. And she said about this experience, she says, I instantly felt God give me the strength to endure whatever would happen next. And in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955, it could be anything. God's peace, she said, flooded my soul. My fear melted away. All people were equal in the eyes of God, and I was going to live like a free person. I felt the Lord would give me the strength to endure whatever I had to face. And God did away with all my fear. It was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, sit down. And I refused to move. What animated Rosa Parks to do that was her faith. It had informed her, because she had faith, she could see what other people who had no faith could not see, namely that all people are equal in the eyes of God, that there is no greater than or lesser than in the human race, that there aren't some important people, that all people are important, all have dignity, all have worth, all are cherished by God, all are willed into existence by God, all are redeemed by the precious blood of Jesus, all are destined to be divinized, all people. She resisted, and the resistance led to the overturning of the law. She's an amazing agent of sabotage to me. 42-year-old woman coming home from work. Just didn't want to move. It doesn't have to be that hard. Just do the right thing. Agents of reconciliation, Jesus calls us to be, sends us out to be. It's another one of our missions, huh? St. Paul says, He himself is our peace, Jesus, who has made us both one and broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Now, I don't know what you hear or see when you hear that passage read, but here's what Paul was probably talking about. He was probably talking about a certain part in the temple. Remember, the temple was just a whole series of demarcations, right? Like, everybody can come into a certain point, and then after that, it's only the Jewish people. And when it was only the Jewish people, we know this because we found archaeologically signs that were in the temple that said, if you die after you cross this spot, it's your fault. That's my translation. The Greek's a lot more eloquent. Jews and Gentiles hated each other, despised one another. Jesus, Paul says, has knocked down the dividing wall of hostility, and he's made us one. Those who used to no longer, or who used to hate each other. I don't have any Polish blood in me, but Poland might be one of my favorite countries in the world. The man on the right, you probably don't know. The man on the left, you do. The man on the right was Adolf Hitler's personal attorney for a number of years. And then he was appointed to be the Governor General of Poland. He earned the infamous nickname, the Butcher of Poland. He was personally responsible for somewhere between probably 2 and 3 million deaths. He was a bad man who did evil things. And the last time I was in Poland, I was reading about his life and how he had died by hanging at Nuremberg. And my response was, good. You lousy whatever. You got what you deserved. And I saw his last words were, may Jesus have mercy on me. And I read that and I went, no. Like, no. How did that happen? Like, no. It happened because of this guy, Father Sixtus O'Connor. Sixtus O'Connor was an American priest who served in World War II. He was fluent in German because of his family. He served with Patton. He personally liberated, or was in the battalion that liberated Mauthausen and maybe 1 or 2 of the other concentration camps. He saw up front and personal what Hans Frank sent people to, what the Nazis did. He saw the corpses. He saw the people who had been living in concentration camps, who were basically human skeletons, come out. He saw with his eyes the wickedness and the evil of this regime. And after the war ends, because he was fluent in German, because he was a priest, Patton nominated him to be one of the chaplains at Nuremberg. And so he went. And he spent most of his time working with Hans Frank. And he led Frank to conversion. This man who had killed millions of people dies with the words, "May Jesus have mercy on my soul." Two people who hated each other in Jesus became brothers. See, the church knows, or should know, that what God does is he takes people who used to despise one another and hate one another and not simply make it so that they can tolerate each other. He changes their hearts so that they can love each other, so they can call each other brother and sister, so that they will lay down their lives for each other. Our country right now is desperately in need of this kind of witness. We are supposed to be the ones who know this happens because he's changed our hearts. And he's sending us out to be a means by which other hearts can get changed as well. Jesus sends us out as well to be agents of recreation. If anyone is in Christ, St. Paul says, we saw this passage earlier, he's a new creation. The old has passed away. There's so many examples of this, but here's one of them that's so striking to me. Here's a young woman who was an atheist, a communist, an anarchist. She was an alcoholic. She had countless affairs. She had an abortion. She tried to kill herself. And on December 28, 1927, Dorothy Day became a Catholic. And she went on to become, in my mind anyway, one of the single most disturbing people to my conscience I've ever come across. People who knew her said to meet Dorothy Day was to wonder afterwards what just hit me. She dedicated her life to the poor, to the homeless, to the underemployed, to the unemployed, to those who are oppressed in countless ways. She lived by the Sermon on the Mount in a way that I find personally convicting beyond belief. She was disturbingly consistent with everything that Jesus says. And she and I, if we were to have a conversation, we would go rounds, I'm sure. But here's a woman who went to daily Mass, prayed the rosary every day, prayed 3 hours every day, was radically in love with Jesus. Not fanatically, radically, meaning from the root, from the center of who she was, who embraced everything the church taught, perhaps most especially in the 60s, all the church's sexual teaching. She was herself recreated, and then she became the means by which, as she cared for all these people who were with her, a means by which they could be recreated. Here's her, and yet another example of somebody who did a similar kind of thing, just helping each person who they met, her and Mother Teresa, know you have dignity, you have worth, you have value, you matter to God, you're loved. And by my presence here, my caring for you, I'm trying to communicate that to you. Jesus sends us out to be those kinds of people. He calls us to be agents of healing. He sends us to be agents of healing. Jesus says, not just to the disciples a long time ago, to you and me right now, whenever you enter a town and they receive you, eat what is set before you. We've done that for you. Heal the sick in it. That's a command. Heal the sick. And say to them, the kingdom of God has come near you. And there's lots of examples here, but the most powerful example I know is my dad. My mom and dad were married on August 5th, 1950. That's their wedding day. And the other picture, I think, is their 40th anniversary, if I remember. My mom grew up a WASP, very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. She lived in Grosse Pointe. Her father, my grandfather, was the most intimidating man I've ever met in my life. He was physically imposing, and he was imposing in every other way as well. He had a 5th, 6th, 7th grade education. He was incredibly intelligent and became a very successful man. He ended up buying the Detroit Lions. We won when he owned the Lions. In 1957, when the Lions won the World Championship, they got a blanket. I have the blanket. I don't think it's worth much. My mom met my dad when they were in college, and when my mom was a freshman, she was all excited one day because her brothers came to visit her, and so she opened the door. There they were. She was ecstatic until they opened their mouths and they told her why they'd come. Turns out that my grandfather, her father, had been for some time leaving the house, and when he left the house, he would just put an extra shirt in his briefcase. And then it was a pair of pants in the briefcase. And then it was a suit under his top coat. And pretty soon, one day, my grandfather went to work and the closet was empty. And my grandmother had never noticed. And so my uncles went to my mom to tell my mom that my grandfather was having an affair and that he had left her mother. And my mother went ballistic. She was enraged. And a wall went up between her and her father that went on for years. She didn't invite him to the wedding. Every wedding gift that he sent to her and my father, she sent back unopened. Every card that he sent, she sent back unopened. And thankfully, the ending of that story with my mom and my grandfather was incredibly positive. She ended up spending the last number of her years caring for him. But it took a lot of time. And the result of this, because my mom was the only daughter, was my mom, she felt like I have been rejected by my father, which means she had this incredibly deep wound in her identity of not being loved, of not being cherished, of being disposable, of being discarded. And when my father met her and he married her, he knew that. He knew that was her wound. And he knew enough about marriage to know that God had brought him into her life to be a means by which that wound could get healed. And I could go on and on and on and on in telling stories of my dad and the love that he had for my mom and the love that she had for my dad. But over the course of the 66 years that they were married, he was intentional and deliberate beyond measure to try to be a means by which God would use him to heal that wound in her, which he knew, despite all her outward appearance, despite any possessions, despite any beauty, despite anything, was still deep inside her, and it caused her tremendous anguish. And he did such an extraordinary job of doing that I heard my mom say to him as he was lying in his casket the most extraordinary words I've ever heard in my life. At my father's funeral, everybody was seated at this point except for my mom and I. We were about to walk in just in front of the casket. And my mom in her wheelchair grabs my father's hand, and she held his hand, and she looked at him and she says, "Honey, because of you, I know who God is." That's an agent of healing. Jesus sends us to be agents of restoration. Easter Sunday, the Gospel of John describes Mary Magdalene turned around. She sees Jesus standing there. She doesn't recognize him. She doesn't know it's him. He's kind of keeping her from understanding who he is yet. And it goes on to say she thought he was the gardener. Well, he was. That's not a mistake. He was the gardener. He is the gardener. God created Adam. He put him where? He put him in a garden. He gave him the task of exercising dominion on the earth. And here's the new Adam on Easter Sunday doing what? Exercising dominion on the earth. He's restoring everything. See, recreation has to do with what happens to me personally. Restoration has to do with something more systemic. Something's being brought back to the original plan for which God had created it. And here's a tremendous agent of restoration for me. Some of us might remember Chuck Colson. If you remember Watergate, Colson was known as Nixon's hatchet man. He once was reported of saying that he would run over either his mother or his grandmother. It gets reported in different ways to get President Nixon reelected. This was a tough son of a gun. And shortly before the Watergate scandal broke, actually before he even found out that he was going to be indicted, he had had a conversation with a friend of his who was an attorney. Colson was an attorney who had come to faith, and he was sharing with Colson some quotes from C.S. Lewis, and he was talking about how overwhelmed this man was. And he talked to Colson about all this. He asked him, "Would you like me to pray with you?" And he says, "No, thank you very much." But he went home and he was troubled by what he had heard, and it began to linger in his mind, and he knew there was something that was happening to him. And then shortly thereafter, the whole Watergate scandal broke, and sure enough, he gets indicted and he goes to prison. While he's in prison, he says this, "I saw the absolute futility of the prison system. There's no way you can take a bunch of criminals, stick them in a dormitory where they sit around at night comparing the crimes they committed and how they're going to do it next time and expect to rehabilitate them. It's demeaning. It's demoralizing. It doesn't give people aspirations to do the right thing. It almost encourages the wrong thing." So I got out of prison and I realized this isn't working. That's what got me to start the prison ministry. So Colson has this encounter with Jesus. He has this experience of a system that isn't working. You need the system because unfortunately people still do bad things. And we need to address that. But you can do that in one way or another. And Colson realizes this way isn't working. I want to do it in a different way. I want to do it in a way that's shaped by the biblical narrative, the biblical story. And so he founds an organization called Prison Fellowship. This is what Prison Fellowship describes their work as. It works to restore America's criminal justice system and those it affects. We help men and women replace the cycle of brokenness that landed them in prison. We advocate for justice reform and activate grassroots networks to do the same. We equip wardens to bring restorative change to their facilities. We care for prisoners' families and help strengthen the bond between children and their parents who are behind bars. We call the church to lead the way in caring for those impacted by the criminal justice system, and we do it all from a biblical worldview. Here's a man who encountered the Lord, who put on the right lenses, and he realized, I got to do what I can to change something which isn't working, and he's done an extraordinary job, or he did before the Lord called him home. And finally, ambassadors. St. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, all that we've been talking about, all of this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. This is to us. To be sure, there's a sacramental dimension of this confession, but to us, to all of us, we're entrusted the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. God, as it were, making his appeal through us. To hear the word ambassador is to think immediately of an embassy. What's an embassy? An embassy is the headquarters of a government serving in a foreign country. It's led by an ambassador who's the representative of the other country's leader. In a certain sense, each and every one of us is an ambassador. We're a representative of the other country's leader. That would be the kingdom of heaven. The leader is God, the good Father, the one who sent his Son to rescue us from sin and death. The embassy isn't subject to the laws of the host country, and it offers asylum and protection from arrest and extradition. This is an image of the church. This is what the church is supposed to be. Tragically, all too often, we are not. Somebody is supposed to walk into a church and to immediately know, who's not a member there, these people, are different. They're not bound by the laws of the host country. What are the laws of the host country? In our case, it's not just sin and death. It's all the ways that those things manifest themselves, right? Because remember, death isn't just the end of my life. I can experience death now. How do we experience death? Division, gossip, slander, attack, forgetting that the enemy is the enemy and thinking it's somebody else. It's that group, it's that group, it's that group. But someone's supposed to walk into a Catholic church, or any church for that matter, and go, these people, they're not bound by those laws. They don't gossip. They don't slander. They're united. And they're like incredibly diverse. They're united around being sold out for Jesus. Because they've come to know who he is and what he's rescued them from. And so they've said, you can have it all. And these people who have nothing in common demographically are suddenly united together around the person of Jesus. And it's palpable, and people can see it. And because they can see it, it's amazingly attractive. And so people want to be a part of it. And it offers asylum. There's a lot of examples of this for me, most personally and most powerfully. It's probably John Paul. I was fortunate to live in Rome in the early 90s for a number of years. I lived in his shadow. I met him more times than I can tell you. We met him so often that we had so many invitations to go see him because of some of the ways things worked here, because the Cardinal of Detroit would be over in Rome so often. We would get a call at 10 o'clock at night saying, hey, would you like to have Mass tomorrow in the Pope's private chapel? And I can't tell you how many times we just said, no. Like, I'm too tired. Sorry. Click. That's how often we met him. But to have met him was an overwhelming experience. I remember things he said to me. I remember the first time I met him. I remember being at Mass with him. And he didn't say this to me, but the experience of meeting him was overwhelming, and to the degree that it was almost like he just looked at you and he said, you know what? You don't have anywhere near the gifts that I have. Let's be honest. But you can be great. So be great. That was what he communicated to meet him. And when he was first elected as Pope, some of us might remember this, his very first homily. He says these words, brothers and sisters, do not be afraid to welcome Christ and accept his power. This is a man who grew up in Poland, who was an orphan by the age of 20, who'd lost his brother, who endures World War II, who's run over by a truck, left for dead by the Germans, works in a quarry. Then he loses World War II again. That's how the Poles describe World War II, when the Soviets took it over. And somehow, on the day he's elected, his words are, don't be afraid. This is extraordinary. Of all the people who had reasons to be afraid, it was this man. He saw this totalitarian regime. His words to the world were, don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. To his saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. So often today, man does not know what is within him, in the depths of his mind and his heart. So often he's uncertain about the meaning of his life on this earth. He's assailed by doubt, doubt which turns into despair. And we're seeing this all around us right now, in the country in which we're living. We ask you, therefore, we beg you, with humility and trust, let Christ speak to man. He alone has the words of life. Yes, of eternal life. God, as it were, appealing through us. What's the appeal? I think it's this. You can defect. You can defect. You don't have to live in this country anymore. You don't have to live under the laws of sin and death. You don't have to live in the home of a cruel tyrant. You don't have to live in a dysfunctional family. You can leave that home. You can move into this home. You can be a part of this family. It will be a credible appeal to the degree that our churches don't live and act as if we're bound by the laws of the host country. It will not be credible if we do. But that's the appeal. You can join us, and we would love to have you, because the good Father is a good Father. And you're his son or his daughter, and he has abundant life for you. Why do we call this the Rescue Project? Why not the Rescued Project? Well, because the rescue doesn't just have to do with what Jesus has done in my life or is doing in us right now. The Rescue Project is in that tense because you and I are supposed to be agents in his hands. We're supposed to go out there. We're supposed to continue this work which Jesus began on Easter Sunday, and which he will bring to a glorious completion when he returns, when he decides it's time to return, which looks like it might be soon, but who knows? Someone wrote this: in the high-stakes drama all around us, we have each been given a part to play, one that bears our name and no one else's. We each have the mercy of God to receive, a self to put to death, a kingdom to gain, a battle to fight, and spiritual enemies to slay, comrades to aid, rebels to win over. The ancient battle rages all around us, and the adventure that we were born for beckons. My whole life, I have aspired to be great. It's what my father encouraged me to be. It's what I've longed to be since I was a child. I'm convinced it's what every single person wants. I want to be great. The world, it plays a reel that says, here's what greatness looks like. Greatness looks like wealth, possessions, this, that, the other thing. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. They're not what greatness is measured by. Greatness is measured by love. Greatness is measured by responding to the love of God and all that he's done for us in his son Jesus. And for us in our work, the single most heroic example of this to us is Joan of Arc. Outside of the Blessed Virgin Mary, if there's a greater woman who's ever lived in human history than Joan of Arc, I don't know who it is. To think what she did at the age of 19, an illiterate peasant girl in an incredibly hierarchical France, to lead an army is unfathomable. And shortly after she begins this campaign that she led, she was approached by someone who said, "Aren't you afraid?" And she says, "Nope, I'm not afraid. God is with me. I was born for this." So were you. So was I. It's not a historical accident that we're alive right now. With everything that's happening in the world, in the country, in the church, like God could have created you to be alive at any moment in history. 3rd century Guatemala, 17th century Cuba. No, he created you and me to be alive right now. And he's given you and me the gifts that he's given to us, both natural and supernatural, and he wants to use us. He wants to use us in a most powerful way to continue the mission and the work of his son, which he began on Easter Sunday and which he will bring to conclusion. But what was I born for? What have I been rescued for? What am I rescued in order to do? Well, let me leave you one last biblical story. The story of the Good Samaritan is one that's familiar to many people. But perhaps it's one of those that's overly familiar. It's probably based on a very true story. It was a common thing for people to travel from Jerusalem to Jericho and to be beat up. There were a lot of robbers who hid on that road. So Jesus tells the story of a man who travels from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on his way, he's assaulted, he's beaten, stripped, left for dead in a ditch. Which means what? It means there's no way to identify him. He has no clothes. Clothes are a distinguishing characteristic. And he can't talk, which means you can't tell where he's from. And he's left for dead. Who's the man in the ditch? I am. You are. The human race is. And along finally comes one from outside, and he sees him. And the way it's usually translated in English is, he was moved with compassion, which is a really pathetic translation. It's something more like his heart was wrenched open when he saw the man in the ditch. And he does something about him. And he takes care of him and he brings him back to life. Who's the Good Samaritan? Jesus. Jesus is the one who, in the conversation in heaven, the whole Trinity, looking at the situation that our race found itself in by our own doing, says, I'll go. I'll bring him back. I'll bring him home. God's heart was wrenched open in mercy for you and for me, and was moved to do something about our situation, to rescue us from the powers that we could never escape on our own. We need that heart. If I'm honest with myself, I don't do a lot of things for other people because my heart just doesn't care. And I'll bet if you're honest with yourself, you're the same. But I need his heart. And here's the thing. When we thank God the way he likes us to be thanked, and we let him give himself to us, you know what happens? He gives us his heart. The precious blood that flows through his heart begins to flow through mine. I get a transfusion from heaven. And my heart is transformed to be like his. And you and I are going to leave here, and we're going to walk outside, and we're going to meet people who either literally or figuratively are lying in a ditch, beaten, left for dead, walking around without any clue about what I'm made for, why am I here, where am I going? They got tons of stuff maybe, but they're still walking dead. They're like I was many years ago, or maybe like you were. And God sends us to them. He wants to pick you up and me up, starting tonight, and walk outside. And he wants to shine brilliantly through you and through me, despite all my imperfections and despite all of yours. That's just how powerful and how good God is, that he can use broken vessels like us to bring him to them. Mary is fond of saying over and over again, a Christian is somebody who has been rescued. Somebody who's been overwhelmed by the gospel, who's surrendered themselves to Jesus in faith, is somebody who has been rescued. What do rescued people do? They rescue people. What's the mission? That's the mission. Rescued people. Rescue people. Let's go do it.